Then I guess just to get started off, can you introduce yourself, just like some personal details as well as your career, like what you do?
I'm Cynthia Oceguera. I am a learning and executive functioning specialist. I live in Mountain View, California. I am a Bay Area resident. I have been my whole life. I grew up in the Bay Area. I went up to college in Oregon and came back. And now I'm back serving the Greater Peninsula.
Do you do currently, and like what do your daily tasks at the clinic entail?
My official title is a learning and executive functioning specialist. So it actually falls under kind of two categories. So a learning specialist is another word for a special educator. I am a private special educator. Essentially, I work one-on-one with students or in small groups to meet intervention goals. Previously, I was working as a learning specialist in a private school. So I had to push in and pull out of students in a private school and really worked on educational goals. So now, privately, I have kids who come most of the time after school, sometimes in the middle of their school day. Sometimes I'm going to kids' schools, it matters on the day. And I'm working towards goals. So we have done an educational assessment, that's either tied into their full neuropsych testing, or I've done an individual assessment. And what we've done with those testings is we've pulled out the processes and things that they need to work on, their intervention goals. And then I'm using research-based curriculums to help them remediate those skills that we need to get better at.
Mhm.
So I'm doing that. So I'm doing testing and intervention. Along with that, I also do a little bit of IEP advocacy. So I'm going with these kiddos or with these parents, their families, to IEP meetings, 504 meetings, student support team meetings, any sort of school meeting, and really discussing the students' educational needs and how we can support that in the classroom. So that's what I'm doing on that side. The executive functioning coaching is a little bit different, but a little bit the same. So executive functioning coaching is really looking at a student's current functioning, how they're working through their lives, how all of those pieces are working, and how it's affected most of the time by their disability, which is usually ADHD or something like ADHD, autism, a variety of other things. Those executive functions get disrupted. We have neurotypical people who also have trouble with executive function. Your executive functions. I have trouble with my executive functions. Everyone does. But what I'm really doing is looking at their executive function. So a kiddo who does all their homework but never turns it in, or someone who is super neat, but then when they get home, their room is a mess, a variety of executive functions that they're struggling with. And we're using skills and strategies to build that for themselves so that they can access that and do that later. So we're looking and saying, well, why is this hard? What happened? What's going on in your brain? What are you thinking about? Are you moving on too fast? And we're looking at those executive functions and we're saying, what skills and strategies can we support that are going to help you next time? So are we using a planner? Are we having a check sheet? Are we just really building some brain internal speaking to myself so that I can get through this task a little bit easier? And so that is also done in a one-on-one setting, but it's a little bit different than the educational part. There's a really big push for reading, writing, math, but then the executive functioning is a little bit different. It's more looking at how they're functioning as being a student and a child in a home and really helping them those functions as well.
That's great. So what led you to major in education and specialize in special education?
So I always knew I wanted to be a teacher from when I was really young. I loved playing teacher when I was a little kid. And I just grew and grew. And then I went to a high school that required service hours. So I was required to do service hours. And part of that service hours for me was working in classrooms with the younger kids. And that's really where it sparked. And I realized I want to do this forever. And so when I was looking into universities, I was really intentional on picking a place where I would be learning education from the get-go. So the school I went to, their education program started day one. And so within a week of starting college, I was working in a classroom as part of my education. And that continued all 4 years and into grad school as well. And so I've always wanted to be a teacher. I was really intentional with making sure I was getting real world experience of being in the classroom and helping students.
Yeah. So what skills would you say are most important for that profession then? Or like during your time at school, what did you find to be the most helpful for like career preparation?
Yeah, so I think experience in the classroom and just being in there and like understanding the teacher side of it and the flow of the day and how much you have to keep in your head at all times is really important. Kind of having experience doing that for a really long time. That's why we always say like veteran teachers are really fantastic teachers because they've done it for so long and it's such a skill that you have to learn. You keep all these things in your head for a really long time. But then there's also like really practical things. So I think the I went to the University of Portland, which was really good at being on top of research and modern understandings of education. Education changes constantly, and what's the best and things like that, it changes all the time. And so we really want to like be on top of that, constantly learning, pushing you to reading new articles, reading new things that are coming out, and really understanding um, education at its best. So I think that's really important as well, is like staying on top of the one part of like modern, research and what's happening, but also having a bunch of experience in the classroom and kind of just knowing what's happening.
Yeah. And then just in terms of your classes, were there any like direct ties to neuroscience or psychology? Like, did you have to take any psych classes or neuro classes to fulfill your like major requirements?
I'm trying to think back, not in undergrad. In undergrad, especially like general education undergrad, was very much
Mhm.
just, like you took your basics of like educational understanding that some of them tied into like how the brain learns and things like that. But they weren't full neuro classes or full psych classes. And then when I started pursuing the special education part, so when I decided I wanted to work with kiddos whose brains weren't learn a little differently, I went and did a lot of research and took a lot of classes about really understanding the brains of kiddos with learning disabilities, developmental disabilities, and some anywhere in between physical disabilities, and really understanding how to educate them. And that was when I took a lot of classes about neuropsych and understanding the brain and processes and neuropsych testing and how that applies and how we could build educational programs around that. So that was mostly when I did special ed, and then into grad school when I did reading, when I became a reading specialist in grad school, that it was a lot of that as well.
Then in your experience, how much, I mean, you just talked about how much theory and how much like conceptual stuff there was to learn. So how much theory versus practice does your job really require?
I would say it takes a lot of practice to apply your theory. So you could like read an educational book about how to teach kindergartners until the cows come home,
Mm.
but your first 10 days trying to teach kindergartners, you're gonna be like, I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing. Like you have to be in there. You have to really like feel that experience. And it's almost like revert, like you almost have to know the experience enough, and then you're like, oh, now I can apply what I did in with my research. Like there's this instinctual thing of being around kids and understanding kids and how to just work with them and how to relate to them and how to be someone who tells them something and they accept it. You have to get really good at that part before you can be like, okay, now I know that this educational theory I read about this week is going to work for this kiddo. How do I deploy that? You can't do that unless you've really built an understanding of that kiddo and they respect you and there's some mutual trust and you can work on it together. And so I think the practical part is super important. You have to be able to like establish relationships with kiddos. If you're teaching a whole class, you have to have some classroom management and know how to teach just a whole class in general. And then you can start applying theory. Sure, there's some theory about classroom management and things like that, but you have to be able to do the personal part before you really go into like the full-on theory part. And that's where I think really being in the classroom, having time in the classroom is super important.
And then I guess what would you advise current middle or high schoolers to do who might be interested in the same field? Like what are some things that they can do now to prepare?
Yeah, so volunteering in classrooms. I know it's harder now. Like when I was in high school, it was super easy to like find a friend of a friend who was a teacher and they would let me go into their classroom and just volunteer. I think it's much harder now with, post COVID and the way the world works. It's harder to kind of spend times in classrooms. But anytime you can really work on that skill of building relationships with young people, in any sort of way. So volunteering with like Big Brothers, Big Sisters, volunteering as a doing some summer work as a tutor, any kind of time where you can really connect with kiddos and work on that piece, I think is really important. And so, babysitting, I think babysitting is great. Babysitting, tutoring, volunteering, working at a summer camp, all of those things give you really good skills to build relationships with kids. So then when you step into the classroom and you're going to teach, you feel really comfortable with the people around you. And then you've kind of taken that layer off. And now you're like, oh, now I can take all the other stuff I've learned, the theory, and really build it in. So I think that's really important. There's not a lot of really great ways to understand like veteran teachers. Teachers don't often write books about what teaching was like. But anytime you could find like a TED talk about it from a teacher, or even like TV shows like Abbott Elementary, which are just ridiculous, funny shows, they really do speak. Like they're funny because they're true. They speak to the lives of teachers and like the things they go through. And so I think understanding the personal side and how to connect with kiddos, but then also understanding like just the world of teaching and being in a school and being a teacher and how that goes, I think is really important for younger kids and middle and high schoolers and people who are looking at this profession to do, because once you go to school, then you'll get a bunch of learning in. Don't worry about it right away.
Yeah. And I guess from there, can you pinpoint or like name one thing that you find super fulfilling about this job, or like what do you enjoy the most about what you currently do?
Yeah, I love what I do. I love what I do every single day. I think building relationships with kiddos where they really feel empowered that they have changed and that they are feeling more successful, I think is like the best part of my job. When a kiddo says like, oh my gosh, I did it, I feel really good about it. Or Cynthia, that thing we worked on this week, I went to school and I tried it and it worked and I feel so much better. That's really fulfilling to me.
Mhm.
Parent feedback is super fulfilling. Parents were like, oh my gosh, Cynthia, like, I don't have to remind him 17 times to take his shoes off, or put his shoes away. That is really exciting. But it's really that building that connection. Most of the time I work one-on-one. So one-on-one connection with a kiddo, sitting there, talking about what's hard, what's working, what's not working. Those are really important. And that's what I love every single day. It's really fun.
And then I guess along the same line, is there anything you wish you could change about what you currently do or the career path that you took?
Is there anything I wish I could change? I wish I got to it sooner. So my career path, as most people you'll speak to in education, they've kind of floated around the place unless you've met the world's best kindergarten teacher who taught kindergarten like right out of college and has taught kindergarten for 20 years. Most people in education have kind of gone through different things. So I was first an elementary private school learning specialist. And then I transitioned into the private sector and I was working as a private learning specialist at a speech therapy center and was doing a lot of work there. And then finally I transitioned and found this job where I really feel really fulfilled and like I'm doing the learning piece, which I love and I've done for a long time, but really filling in that executive functioning piece. And then with my practice also being a medical practice with the Sutcliffe Clinic, I'm able to kind of build in other supports for kiddos and really see that whole child approach to working with a kiddo and a family. It's really fantastic. So yeah, if getting to it faster would be fantastic. And then just spreading the word about this is like a path you can take. I think often when you're educated to be a teacher, it's very much like you pick a school, you start teaching at that school, and unless you have to move, then you move schools or you can move grades. But there's not a lot of discussion about like, what's outside of that and what you could do privately. And so I think it's really nice to kind of spread the word that you can do this privately, and it's really fulfilling in order to like help students not within the confines of like a school day, but outside of that and being able to help students and families.
I think that's all the questions I have. Thank you so much for speaking with me.
This was awesome. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.